The address that follows was first recorded at the Nivalion Legal Finance Summit in Frankfurt on the 7th of September 2022. To discuss the European Collective Redress Directive, we must first understand the current reality of consumer redress in Europe. I will be focusing on mass infringements, that is, unlawful behavior that affects thousands or millions of consumers. The reality is that in Europe, so far, we have almost no consumer redress. All over Europe, going back as far as there is memory, we can count on our fingers the examples of cases where a significant percentage of consumers harmed by a mass infringement have been compensated. The rare examples of mass damages being paid are almost always associated to voluntary payment by infringers, usually as a result of social pressure or government measures, or to the intervention of regulators or ombudsmen. There was, for example, the Dutch Fortis case, the UK Payment Protection Insurance case, the Slovenian electricity cartel, and the Portuguese utility security case. The directive tackles redress through litigation. If we look only at damages paid out as a result of litigation, it is hard to find a single case anywhere in Europe where more than a small percentage of injured consumers were compensated. The Volkswagen Dieselgate case made it painfully obvious for all to see the result of the options of the European legal orders when it comes to consumer redress. In the USA and Canada, all injured consumers were compensated. In Europe, litigation is still ongoing, but it is already guaranteed that only a very small percentage of injured consumers will ever be compensated. As European citizens, I believe we should be outraged by this status quo. It is the very denial of the rule of law. It means that billions of euros remain in the wrong hands, in a massive redistribution of wealth. And all thanks to the inability of our legal systems to provide redress for unlawful practices. But we should also be outraged from a business perspective. There are enormous untapped markets for funding, legal services, economic consultancies, etc. In the vast majority of mass consumer cases, each consumer suffers a very small amount of damage. All available data proves that for small damage suffered by a large number of consumers, only representative actions in the opt-out model can ever make undertaking compensate more than a small percentage of injured consumers. By my estimate, at most 5% of mass consumer cases involve a significant amount of damage per consumer, meaning at least 1,000 euros. This dividing line can be higher or lower, depending on the field of law, the complexity of the case, on how easy it is to identify and reach out to injured consumers, to book build, how high are the litigation and adverse costs, etc. For this small group of cases, we have several recent examples that show us that even without opt-out, existing mechanisms can achieve economies of scale and provide redress for some consumers. Whether via opt-in representative actions, assignment, or bundling of claims handled by the same law firm or backed by the same funder, the large common costs can be split amongst the various actions, and the individual damage is high enough to justify book building costs and to make it rational for consumers to take steps to join these actions. It is difficult to have an exhaustive view of the situation in Europe because we do not have data covering all areas of consumer protection all over Europe. In fact, we don't even have data exhaustively covering consumer litigation in any European country in any area of the law. I am currently completing a survey on antitrust consumer redress in Europe, and I would like to share with you firsthand some of the results of that survey. Of course, competition law represents only one of the areas of consumer redress litigation, but it is one for which we have the most data available. We can then extrapolate from this data approximate estimations concerning the reality for other areas of the law. So, how many consumer actions have there been in Europe in competition law? As you can see, as far as there is evidence, until mid-2020, on the left, there were very few indeed. In the last 2 years, on the right, we've seen a boom in opt-out actions, especially in 3 jurisdictions. This boom in actions results from a combination of opt-out with third-party funding. The lower figure in the Netherlands is specific to antitrust because in other areas, that jurisdiction has been prolific in originating WOMCA cases. Attempts at opt-in or individual consumer antitrust actions have all but disappeared. The only exceptions are the car cartels and the Euribor cases in Spain, which are claimed to have led to more than 2,000 euros damage per person. Even in those, however, if we count the cases already filed and the ones which are being prepared, no more than 2.5% of affected consumers will end up seeking redress. Even more impressive is how much compensation has already been paid to consumers in Europe for antitrust infringements as a result of litigation. As shown in this slide, almost none. Of course, this is likely to change in the following years as all the opt-out actions currently running are concluded. But that will not change the fact that so far, the options of European legal systems have led to virtually no compensation for antitrust infringements ever being secured by consumers in courts. If we look at the amounts currently being litigated, we can see a drastic change. Over 45 billion euros in alleged damages are now before courts, but almost all of that is being litigated in the UK. In 24 of the 29 surveyed states, there are no news of any ongoing consumer antitrust case. And to be clear, this is not because consumers from other member states are suing for damages or are being represented in actions occurring in one of those 5 countries. No, there is a complete absence of consumer redress for antitrust infringements going on for consumers of 24 states. And only a small minority of the infringements which caused harm to consumers are being addressed in the other 5. This means there is an immense amount of consumer antitrust damages which is not being litigated. Experience shows that litigation of this type can often go as far back as 20 years. Indeed, several of the current opt-out cases do go back that far. If we consider that period and use the European Commission's 2008 projections, I estimate that European consumers suffer at least 37.5 billion euros in antitrust damage every year. That means at least 750 billion euros over 20 years. In other words, 750 billion euros of unlawful gains that European companies and foreign multinationals kept, which should have been in the pocket of European consumers. Our existing laws allow tackling only 7.5 billion euros of that amount. And that would be using opt-out in the 4 jurisdictions where this mechanism has already been implemented, and using other models for cases of large damages in other states. In other words, unless laws change, at most 10% of consumer antitrust damages in Europe can ever be addressed in court. In reality, far less than that will be litigated. And more importantly, over 415 million European consumers will not have access to effective redress mechanism for any antitrust infringement. At best, we are currently litigating only 6% of consumer antitrust damages in Europe. This percentage sounds exaggerated, however. If we look at the ongoing cases, they suggest that my figure for total damages may be very underestimated. Let's now turn to the lost business opportunities that result from the deficiencies of our consumer redress mechanisms. By my estimates, the consumer antitrust damages litigation currently going on represent funding commitments of 400 million euros, and they could lead to returns of up to 13.6 billion euros. At best scenario, of course. I also estimate that the current antitrust consumer actions lead to a legal services market of about 110 million euros a year and 13.5 million euros in economic consultancy services. Again, these are likely to be conservative figures. However, if we changed the laws in every member state in order to have fully effective redress mechanisms, funders could be looking at opportunities of 6.5 billion euros in investment, leading to potentially up to 225 billion euros in returns if we were to use a 30% return rate. The European legal services market specific to these cases could grow as high as 1,850 million euros per year, and the economic consultancy services could grow to 230 million euros per year. Remember, these are conservative figures, even for antitrust, and they refer only to antitrust consumer cases. How much bigger would all these figures be if we were to include consumer redress for infringements in other areas of the law? Already, we're seeing a lot of litigation around unfair commercial practices, data protection, financial, energy, and communication services, flight delays and cancellations, Dieselgate, etc. It is not a stretch to assume that these figures would be at least 4 times as large if we considered all potential consumer redress cases. So what do we need to do to change this state of affairs? What do we need to do to ensure effective redress for European consumers? I believe the answer begins and ends with a test of economic and pragmatic viability. All too often, our legislators and courts are content with the existence of a theoretical right to damages and see no problem in the rules if they make it economically irrational or impossible in practice to successfully sue for damages. That is just window dressing. It is meant to create an appearance of rule of law, where in fact we are confronted with lawlessness. No one can look at the reality of the figures just presented and pretend that the current system works. So let us learn from the failures and successes of the various systems in force. What do they tell us? Models based on opt-in, assignment, and individual actions will only work when each consumer's damage is higher than 1,000 euros. There are a few areas where a lower figure is enough, although I don't think that they would be economically viable in litigation in most countries. This is the case of damages for flight cancellations, for example. There are a few areas where a higher figure is needed, such as antitrust cases. There we see that at least 2,000 euros in damages per consumer is needed. However, we must also be aware that all precedents show that even in cases with quite large damage per consumer, these systems only lead to the litigation on behalf of a small minority of injured consumers. So they are effective, yes, but for some, not for most. Infringers are allowed, under these systems of opt-in, assignment, and individual actions, to keep most of their unlawful gains if these are the only options that consumers have available. In other words, for the vast majority of consumers, and in the case of small damage for all consumers, Actions for damages are only viable with opt-out representation and with the possibility of third-party funding that can be remunerated at market rates. As Belgium shows, it's useless to have opt-out without the possibility of claimants recouping costs, including funding. There are, of course, many little details that can deprive this system of its effectiveness. As always, the devil is in the details, but these are the two crucial characteristics. And let's not kid ourselves. Experience shows that to litigate mass consumer cases adequately, even in relatively affordable jurisdictions, one typically requires, at minimum, hundreds of thousands of euros. Even with opt-out and third-party funding, pan-European cases involving extra small damages will end up not being litigated in the smaller member states. If each consumer was, for example, injured in 2 euros, the practice caused damages in excess of 1 billion euros all over Europe. This is important. This practice is not de minimis. It will be economically viable to run an opt-out case in Germany, in Italy, in Poland, in Portugal, etc. But it will not be viable to litigate, even with opt-out, in Malta, Luxembourg, Cyprus, Estonia, Latvia, or Slovenia. It is doubtful that it would be viable to litigate in Croatia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, or Ireland, for example. This is very troubling. It's a very unfair difference in the degree of protection of consumers in the small member states and in the larger ones. And this is assuming that we had a perfect system in force in all the member states with opt-out and funding. But there is an obvious solution. We need multi-jurisdictional consumer litigation, at least for these cases of very small damage. The only effective solution is to allow an opt-out action filed in one member state to represent consumers from several states, including the smallest ones. Until now, there has never been an example of multi-jurisdictional antitrust consumer litigation in Europe. In other areas of the law, we have had some multi-jurisdictional Wickham settlements in the Netherlands, and a few thousand consumers from other member states were represented in an opt-in Dieselgate action in Germany. But this just showed the very limited success of multi-jurisdictional opt-in, even in cases with large damages per consumer. Okay, so we've seen the current status quo, and I've addressed what I think needs to change in order for there to be effective consumer redress in Europe. That is the stated goal of the European Collective Redress Directive. So let us now see what the directive does and whether it is likely to change the status quo. I think it is clear from the image I selected that, in my opinion, it will not, at least not in itself. I've written with my dear friend Maria José Azarbo that we believe the directive is a sheep in wolf's clothing. It sets off from the recognition that the current system is not working, but then, actually, it does only two things. First, it requires member states to have some consumer redress mechanism in place to be used by qualified entities recognized in other member states. States remain free to choose any system they want, including to keep their current systems even if they are manifestly not working. In other words, the directive here gives consumer associations from other countries the right to use other states' mostly useless systems. Second, the directive requires imposing a number of safeguards as a reaction to fears of abuse, especially for third-party litigation. There is no requirement to allow funding, only restrictions if it is allowed. That being said, The safeguards for funding are reasonable and mostly in harmony with the UNIDRA rules. The directive's only positive contribution is to guarantee transnational availability of whatever option each state chooses. And then it sets out various limits and restrictions. I do not think I have ever seen a directive with so many provisions that do not impose obligations, only mention options and possibilities. Instead of applying to any consumer redress based on EU law, it only applies to a list of European laws and rules. Incredibly, it doesn't apply to antitrust infringements, and no one bothered to explain why. It also doesn't require opt-out, not even for cases where that is clearly the only effective solution. Although in the future, the court may interpret the principles of effectiveness and non-discrimination as requiring opt-out in some cases. But let me make a correction. The directive does impose opt-out, but only for injunctions. This means that the EU legislator has no problem with every consumer being represented without having a word, as long as it only leads to imposition of behaviors for the future, but not to obtain damages. The directive prohibits cross-border opt-out actions. The Dutch Wickham multi-jurisdictional settlements, for example, will no longer be possible. Even if all states allowed opt-out, this rule would mean that instead of one action to represent all injured EU consumers, consumer representatives would need to file at least 27 separate actions. This hugely multiplies costs, and it creates risks of conflicting judgments and varying protection of EU consumers. As mentioned before, it also ensures that the consumers of smaller member states will often never get redress. The directive has a lot of trapdoors that can be used by legislators and courts to render the mechanisms foreseen in the directive ineffective. In the interest of time, I will not go over these. Another problem with the directive is that there are many things missing in it. Nothing ensures economic viability of these actions. There is no attempt to provide an EU-wide solution for EU-wide infringements. No rules on how to handle multiple cases concerning the same infringement. There is no concern with promoting redress measures by national or European regulators or ombudsmen or other public authorities. There's no imposition of a global compensation system, etc. In other words, the directive was a resounding success for business lobbies, in particular for the American Chamber of Commerce, and a shameful failure for the democratic system which is supposed to protect consumers. And already we are seeing signs that states will stick to their guns. Those who have been uninterested in the effectiveness of consumer redress so far will change as little as possible in their laws, at least for now. An example of this is the recently published Irish draft transposition. But I do not want to end on a negative note. I do think that things will change for the better. The last 10 years have shown us that even though at EU level, lobbyists keep winning this fight, some national legislators recognize the need to change their laws to introduce truly effective systems. We have seen effective reforms, for example, in the UK, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Slovenia. We also see market forces pushing change, being inventive, resorting to artificial intelligence to increase the number of small damages cases that can be litigated, etc. And I think that as the first opt-out cases are successful in the jurisdictions that allow them, citizens in other states will start asking, why do they get money and we don't? Governments will start wondering, why they are throwing away millions in undistributed compensation that could be used for the greater good. Lawyers, economists, and other service providers will want the same boost to their invoicing as they see occurring in the countries with opt-out. In fact, all we need to do is look around at the many agents who have recently entered this market to understand that something different is happening in Europe right now. Collective redress is no longer just a discussion for academics. It has become the focus of market forces. Sooner or later, politicians will see that there is no cause for fear of abuses in Europe. These market forces need to be regulated, yes, but we already have most of the necessary safeguards. Politicians, I hope, will begin finding it impossible to allow this desert of consumer redress to remain when it would be so easy to bring water to it. Thank you very much.